The rules that nobody printed. There was a time in America when the most important rules didn't live in a book. You didn't find them on a shelf or get them on a worksheet. Nobody sat you down and explained them in a quiet classroom voice. Instead, you absorbed them the same way you absorb weather, by standing outside long enough to feel it change. You didn't just learn how people talked, you learned how people acted. And if you paid attention, you could almost feel the town watching, like a porch light that stays on. Not glaring, just present. Not mean, just aware.
And here's the thing, these weren't huge laws. They were small daily choices, the kind you could make in a second. But they shaped how safe people felt, how welcome they were, and how much trust a community carried from one season to the next.
You learned by watching people, not being told. If you grew up in that kind of town, you didn't receive a neat list of expectations. You received a life lesson, over and over, by watching.
You watched your father when he greeted someone on the street. You watched your mother when she handled a visit, a plate, a favor. You watched older neighbors, people who'd been through storms you hadn't seen yet, move through their days with steady manners.
And you watched everyone else too. Grandparents, teachers, people at the corner store, neighbors who seemed to know what time it was just by looking at the sky.
After supper, front porches were like community classrooms. People didn't just talk, they modeled. They showed you what respect looked like in real time. They showed you what responsibility sounded like when it wasn't being paid for. If you paid attention, you learned how to behave. If you didn't, the whole town noticed. Not in a dramatic gotcha way, more like people remembered. People connected your behavior to your character, and character around there mattered.
3. The first rule, you greet people. One of the earliest unwritten rules was simple enough that it could have been overlooked. You greet people.
Walking past a neighbor without saying hello wasn't a mistake. It was rude. People didn't have to write that down. They just felt it in their bones. A nod, a smile, a wave from the truck.
Sometimes it was quick, so quick it barely felt like a conversation, but it carried meaning. It said, "I see you." It said, "We share this place." It reminded everyone that community wasn't an idea, it was a habit. And when those greetings became common, something powerful happened. People relaxed. They weren't strangers passing each other like ships in the night. They were neighbors. Same road, same weather, same small stretch of life.
Never show up empty-handed. Another unwritten rule hit the moment you stepped through a doorway. Never show up empty-handed.
If you were visiting friends for supper, you brought something. Maybe it was a pie that cooled on the counter with a sweet smell drifting through the kitchen. Maybe you carried fresh vegetables from a garden or a market run. Maybe you had homemade bread, something warm enough to make the whole house feel like it was doing better already. And even if you couldn't bring much, you brought what you could. A small gift for the children, something thoughtful, even simple. This wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about gratitude being visible.
Old town hospitality wasn't take and go. It was thank you, and here's my share. Because in that world, showing up mattered. Showing up and giving something back mattered more. That's how people said, we belong to each other.
Sometimes you didn't have everything you needed. Tools broke, weather damaged things. So another unwritten rule grew out of that reality. If you borrow something, you keep your promise. A ladder, a hammer, a shovel, a part of someone's day. You returned it quickly, in good condition, not when you get around to it, not after weeks disappear. You brought it back like it was part of your reputation, because in practice it was. Holding on to borrowed items too long didn't just make the owner inconvenienced, it made people wonder who you really were. In a small community, delays felt like character. And that's why this rule wasn't just about equipment, it was about trust, the kind that forms when people can depend on you, Helping neighbors wasn't optional, and children were part of it. Nobody waited for an invitation. If a neighbor was stacking hay before a storm, you stopped to help. If a family moved into town, you showed up with extra hands, because moving day was heavy and everyone knew it.
If a roof needed repair, men climbed ladders together like it was a shared chore, not a personal favor. You didn't ask, "Is this my job?" You asked, "How can I help?"
And children? Children weren't treated like a their problem line item. They were watched by the whole neighborhood. Every adult seemed to carry a quiet responsibility because everyone benefited when kids were safe. If a child wandered too close to the road, someone called out. If a bicycle crashed, the nearest adult hurried over. That wasn't seen as interfering. It was being a good neighbor. It was saying, we look out for our own. When kids grew up with that kind of attention, they learned something deeper than rules. They learned that care was normal. They learned their community would notice if something went wrong. In that old way of living, your word had weight. A handshake meant something. A promise wasn't casual. Breaking a promise didn't just disappoint one person. It could damage your reputation for years, not because everyone was keeping score for fun, but because trust is hard to rebuild. Once it's broken, people remember. Keeping a promise earned respect. It was the kind of respect that doesn't come from titles or money. It came from reliability. And that reliability showed up in small moments. When you said you'd return a tool, you did. When you agreed to help, you showed up. When you promised something, big or small, you meant it. In a community like that, honesty wasn't just being truthful. It was being consistent enough that others could build their lives with confidence. Respect older people and show it with action. Another unwritten rule: respect older people. Carry heavy bags, offer your seat, check on elderly neighbors after a storm. In that mindset, age wasn't treated as an inconvenience. Age was associated with wisdom, and wisdom deserved kindness. So respect wasn't something you felt privately. It was something you did in public. Even the smallest actions, like helping someone step over a curb or bringing groceries inside, carried the message, you're part of us. And when you treated older people well, you learned something about yourself too. You learned that dignity isn't only for the young or the successful. It's for anyone who's earned the right to be cared for. There was also a quiet rule that sounded almost too simple. Leave a place better than you found it. Close the gate. Pick up litter. Sweep the floor. Repair what you accidentally damaged. No grand announcement. No applause. Just the idea that your impact matters, even if your impact is small, even if nobody's watching, especially if nobody's watching. And these small things revealed a lot about character, because anybody can be kind for a minute. But the real question is, do you take responsibility when it would be easier not to? That same spirit showed up in everyday manners too, manners that reached beyond the family home. Treat store clerks with respect. Say thank you. Hold the door. Speak politely. Good behavior wasn't reserved for important people. It was for everyone. Cashiers, neighbors, strangers, kids, elders. When that became normal, life felt smoother. Not because people were perfect, but because they were considerate. Hospitality, hard times, and the clearest rule of all: honesty. Hospitality was another unwritten rule that made towns feel warmer than you'd expect. Coffee was ready. An extra chair could always be found. Unexpected visitors weren't treated like a problem to solve. You didn't dodge company, you welcomed it. Sometimes, a lifelong friendship started from an unplanned conversation. Someone stopping by, someone asking a question, someone sharing a laugh in the kitchen. And then there was the rule for hard times, the kind of rule you don't notice until you need it. If a neighbor lost a job, people helped. If someone became sick, meals appeared. If tragedy struck,
the community stood together. Nobody wanted a family to face hardship alone. Nobody wanted the hardest days to feel even heavier because help never arrived.
So help did arrive, quietly, consistently, like it had been prepared in advance, even when nobody knew the forecast. That's what made the kindness feel real. It wasn't performative, it was practical.
And perhaps the strongest unwritten rule was honesty. A lost wallet was returned. Money found on the sidewalk was handed over. A mistake was admitted.
Old-time thinking held that honesty cost less than dishonesty, not just financially, socially. Dishonesty creates problems you can't easily fix later. Honest behavior, on the other hand, keeps relationships stable. It keeps reputations intact. So honesty wasn't just about never stealing. It was about being the kind of person others felt safe trusting. And when you combine all these rules, greetings, gifts, returning what you borrow, helping without being asked, watching out for children, respecting older people, leaving places better, practicing hospitality, standing by people in crises, keeping your word, and telling the truth, you get something bigger than etiquette. You get trust. You get a town where people believed that their neighbors would show up, not disappear. A place where small kindnesses weren't separate from daily life. They were daily life. A wave from a truck meant, I see you. A handshake meant, I mean it. A borrowed tool returned on time meant, you can count on me. A shared meal said, you're not alone. Of course, old America wasn't perfect. People argued, families struggled, life could be hard. But many communities still held on to something worth remembering. A strong town wasn't built by extraordinary heroes. It was built by ordinary people doing ordinary things the right way, over and over, until those actions became normal. That's probably why these unwritten rules lasted for so many generations. They asked for very little. A little honesty, a little kindness, a little hard work, a little respect. And maybe the strangest thing of all, they were never written down. Yet somehow, almost everyone knew them. If you want, you can try spotting these rules in your own neighborhood today. You'll notice them the same way you notice a familiar song. Once it's in your ear, you start hearing it everywhere. Hello words, returned favors, extra chairs, and the quiet courage of people who decide to help before they're asked.